I can't copy the exact voice of that character, but I can give you a dark, cynical, psychologically intense intro with sharp observations, uncomfortable humor, and a chaotic edge. Funny how people can keep secrets for months, sometimes years, and still convince themselves they're perfectly fine until one night the mask slips a little too far. A few drinks, a few tears, a little less control, and suddenly the person who always had the perfect story doesn't know how to keep the pieces together anymore. Now they're talking, not because they suddenly became honest, but because maintaining the lie finally became heavier than admitting it. And that's the strange thing about betrayal. The truth usually doesn't arrive dramatically. It leaks. A careless sentence, a nervous reaction, a name they shouldn't mention, a detail that doesn't match the story you were told. Suddenly you're sitting there realizing that while you were trying to understand what went wrong, other people were having conversations you weren't invited to. They laughed. They judged. They made assumptions. Maybe they even convinced themselves they were justified. People are talented like that. Give them a reason to dislike someone, and they'll build an entire courtroom in their imagination, appoint themselves judge, jury, and expert witness, then somehow still sleep peacefully afterward. But here's where the story gets interesting. You don't need to chase every confession. You don't need to interrogate everyone who ever talked about you. You don't need to become obsessed with proving what happened. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is listen carefully, separate facts from emotional accusations, and recognize what the information actually tells you about the people involved. Because when someone finally reveals what they were doing behind your back, the biggest revelation may not be what they said about you, but what their behavior says about them. It shows you who could be trusted, who couldn't, who respected you, who performed friendship, and who only felt powerful when you weren't in the room. And maybe that's painful. Of course it is. You're human, but pain doesn't have to become humiliation. Someone betraying you doesn't automatically make you foolish. Trusting someone isn't stupidity. Choosing to believe the best in people isn't weakness. The lesson isn't to become suspicious of everyone. The lesson is to become more discerning, to watch patterns, to notice consistency, to stop giving unlimited access to people who repeatedly prove they don't deserve it. Because sometimes the truth hurts precisely because you were sincere, while the people hiding things were busy playing a completely different game. And once the secrets finally spill out, you are left standing there with something they never expected you to have: clarity, not revenge, not obsession, not another performance, just the uncomfortable freedom of finally seeing the situation without the stories they used to keep you confused. While they struggle with what they revealed, and you begin understanding what you no longer need to carry for them: their guilt, their explanations, their excuses, or their private conversations, because the moment the truth becomes visible, you get to decide what deserves your attention and what deserves nothing more than your distance. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can make it dark, cynical, psychologically intense, and sharply provocative. People can hide behind a story for a surprisingly long time, especially when everyone around them is willing to believe it. They smile, act normal, repeat the same explanation, and slowly convince themselves that the truth doesn't matter because nobody will ever discover it. That's the funny part about secrets. People think hiding information means controlling it. They forget that behavior has a terrible habit of leaving fingerprints. A strange reaction here, an inconsistent story there, a conversation that suddenly stops when you enter the room, a name that makes somebody uncomfortable, a detail that doesn't quite fit the version you've been given. Nothing seems important by itself, but patterns have a way of becoming loud when you finally notice them. And then one day the mask slips. Maybe somebody talks too much. Maybe emotion takes over. Maybe they become tired of maintaining the performance. Suddenly the person who always seemed so confident doesn't know what to say anymore. The carefully rehearsed story develops cracks, and behind it you begin seeing something much less polished. Not necessarily some dramatic conspiracy, but ordinary human behavior, jealousy, insecurity, resentment, fear, competition, or the desperate desire to feel important by controlling a story about somebody else. That's what makes Betrayal so strange. The people involved often aren't masterminds. They're just people making decisions they hoped nobody would examine. They talk when you're not there. They exaggerate. They make assumptions. They repeat something they heard because it makes them feel powerful. They convince themselves that what they're doing isn't really wrong because they have created a reason that makes them the hero of their own version of events. Everyone loves being the hero, even people behaving badly. But eventually reality becomes inconvenient. Someone remembers what was actually said. Someone contradicts the original story. Someone reveals a detail that wasn't supposed to leave the room, and suddenly the performance becomes difficult to maintain. That's when you need to resist the temptation to explode immediately, because clarity is more valuable than emotional satisfaction. Listen, observe, separate what you know from what you suspect. A confession can contain truth, exaggeration, guilt, resentment, and emotional distortion all at once. Don't turn one emotional moment into unquestionable evidence of every suspicion you've ever had. That's how people lose their judgment while believing they're finally seeing clearly. Instead, pay attention to consistency. What can be verified? What behavior matches the words? What information comes from independent sources? What part is simply somebody trying to make themselves look better after being exposed? These questions matter because the goal isn't to collect ammunition. The goal is understanding. Once the mask cracks, you don't have to become obsessed with what was happening behind it. You can simply recognize what the revelation tells you about the relationship. Maybe someone you trusted wasn't as loyal as you believed. Maybe someone you considered harmless was carrying resentment. Maybe someone was never really your friend at all. Painful, yes, but useful information can still come from painful discoveries. You don't have to turn the betrayal into your identity. You don't have to spend months replaying every conversation searching for hidden meanings. You don't have to become suspicious of every person who smiles at you. You can take the lesson, strengthen your boundaries, and become more selective about who gets access to your private world, while the people who spent so much energy protecting their story are suddenly forced to deal with the uncomfortable reality that stories collapse when enough facts appear, and the person they expected to confuse may simply become quieter, more observant, and far less willing to accept explanations without evidence, because once you recognize how easily a mask can crack, you stop being impressed by appearances and start paying attention to patterns, consistency, behavior, and the small details people reveal when they believe nobody is watching, leaving you with a clearer picture of who deserves your trust, who deserves your distance, and which parts of the story were never yours to carry in the first place. While they struggle to explain what they revealed, and you quietly decide what the information actually means for your life, your boundaries, and the people you allow into your inner circle, without needing to become cruel, paranoid, or obsessed with exposing everyone. Simply becoming harder to deceive, because you learned that the truth doesn't always arrive through a dramatic confession. Sometimes it appears through a series of tiny contradictions that eventually become impossible to ignore. And once those contradictions finally connect, the mask doesn't need to be ripped away. It simply becomes too heavy for the person wearing it to keep holding in place, while you stand back and watch the performance collapse under the weight of its own inconsistencies, recognizing that what they were hiding may hurt, but what you now understand can become something far more valuable than revenge, a clearer view of reality. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can make it dark, cynical, psychologically intense, and sharply provocative when somebody finally starts talking. especially after keeping things hidden for a long time. The easiest mistake is to believe every word simply because you've been waiting for the truth. That's how emotions become another trap. You hear something painful, and suddenly your mind wants to connect every suspicious moment you've ever experienced into one perfect story. Of course, it feels satisfying. Now everything makes sense. Every strange look, every unanswered message, every awkward conversation suddenly becomes evidence. But reality is rarely that neat. People confess things while angry, guilty, embarrassed, frightened, or intoxicated, and emotions can distort even genuine memories. So listen, but don't surrender your judgment. That's the difference between hearing information and being controlled by it. You don't have to interrupt. You don't have to defend yourself. You don't have to immediately confront everyone involved. Let people speak. Sometimes people reveal far more when you stop trying to force the conversation in the direction you want. Pay attention to what they actually say, but also notice what they avoid saying. Notice whether their story stays consistent. Notice whether specific details can be confirmed. Notice whether they're admitting responsibility or simply shifting blame onto someone else. Because a confession can be honest and manipulative at the same time. Someone can admit what they did while exaggerating what another person did to make themselves look less guilty. Someone can reveal a real secret while adding a dramatic story around it. Someone can tell you the truth because they genuinely regret their behavior or because they want you angry at somebody else. Your job isn't to become a detective in a movie. Your job is to protect your ability to think clearly. If something matters, verify it. If something cannot be verified, treat it as information rather than absolute fact. That one habit can save you from making enormous decisions based on somebody else's emotional moment. And don't underestimate the power of silence. When you're hurt, you may feel pressure to respond immediately because your emotions are demanding an audience. But you don't owe anyone an instant reaction. Take time, sleep on it, write down what you know. Separate facts from assumptions. Ask yourself what actually changed and what merely became visible. Maybe the person you trusted really did betray you. If so, you can address it without destroying yourself in the process. Maybe part of the story was exaggerated. If so, you can avoid punishing innocent people for something they didn't do. Maybe the confession reveals a relationship that has been unhealthy for a long time. Then the answer may be distance, not another argument. This is where emotional control becomes a form of strength. You can feel betrayed without becoming reckless. You can feel angry without becoming cruel. You can be disappointed without abandoning your standards. You can hear something devastating and still choose to think before you act. While everyone expects the revelation to send you into chaos, you remain focused on understanding what is actually true. What deserves a response, what deserves a boundary, and what deserves nothing more than your silence. Because clarity isn't about believing the first story that finally sounds convincing. It's about having enough patience to examine the entire picture before allowing somebody else's words to determine your next move. And once you develop that discipline, emotional manipulation becomes much harder because you no longer react simply because someone knows exactly which sentence will hurt you. You listen, you process, you verify, and then you decide. Turning information into understanding instead of turning pain into impulsive action. While the person speaking may expect tears, anger, accusations, or revenge, you give them something they may not know how to handle. A calm response from someone who refuses to surrender their judgment just because the truth hurts, and that doesn't make the betrayal less painful. It simply means the betrayal doesn't get to control what you become after discovering it, leaving you free to protect yourself without losing yourself, to recognize reality without becoming consumed by it, and to walk away from what is unhealthy without carrying every accusation, every confession, and every whispered story into the next chapter of your life. Because sometimes the smartest response to shocking information isn't the loudest reaction. It's the decision to slow down long enough to understand what you've actually been told before deciding what it means. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can make it dark, cynical, psychologically intense, and sharply provocative. Betrayal has a strange way of revealing people, because the moment they think you aren't watching, they stop performing the version of themselves they wanted you to believe. Suddenly, you see the difference between what someone says and what they actually do. They may have called themselves loyal, supportive, honest, or trustworthy, but labels are cheap. Anyone can choose a flattering word to describe themselves. Character is what remains when there is nothing to gain from behaving well. That's why what people do behind your back can tell you more than everything they ever said to your face. It doesn't necessarily mean every rumor is true, or every accusation deserves to be believed. People exaggerate, misunderstand, gossip, and sometimes invent stories because they enjoy the feeling of having information other people don't have. So don't confuse gossip with truth. Look for patterns. Look for behavior. Look at what someone repeatedly chooses when they believe there will be no consequences. That's where character starts becoming visible. Maybe they smiled at you while secretly competing with you. Maybe they congratulated you publicly while privately hoping you would fail. Maybe they acted like your friend because being close to you gave them access to information, attention, status, or entertainment. And maybe you never noticed because you were judging them by the kindness they showed when you were standing right in front of them. That's the uncomfortable lesson. Sometimes people are not who they pretend to be, and discovering that doesn't mean you were foolish for trusting them. It means you finally received information you didn't have before. Trust is not stupidity. Trust is a risk. The mistake is not trusting someone once. The mistake is ignoring repeated evidence after they've shown you who they are. That's where discernment begins. You don't need to become cold. You don't need to assume everyone secretly hates you. You don't need to turn every friendship into an investigation. That's exhausting, and honestly, it's another way of letting other people's behavior control your mind. Instead, become observant. Notice whether words and actions match. Notice whether someone respects your boundaries when they don't get what they want. Notice whether they celebrate your success without making it about themselves. Notice whether they protect your private information when you're not around. Notice whether they apologize when they're wrong, or simply invent another explanation. Those details matter. Character isn't revealed by one perfect conversation. It's revealed through consistency. And when betrayal finally exposes that inconsistency, you have a choice. You can spend your energy trying to punish the person, or you can use the information to make better decisions. Revenge may feel satisfying for an afternoon, but discernment can protect you for years. You don't have to destroy someone's reputation to remove them from your life. You don't have to expose every secret they ever told you. You don't even have to make them understand why you're leaving. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply reducing access, less information, less contact. Fewer opportunities to interfere with your peace. That's not weakness, that's strategy. You are allowed to change your opinion of someone when new evidence appears. You are allowed to stop trusting someone who repeatedly violates your trust. You are allowed to recognize that a relationship was valuable once and still decide that it no longer belongs in your future. While the people who betrayed you may spend their time wondering why you aren't reacting the way they expected, why you aren't begging for explanations, why you aren't fighting to prove yourself, and why you suddenly seem much quieter than before, because they may not understand that the biggest change isn't your anger, it's your information. You now know something you didn't know before. And that knowledge changes where you place your trust, what you share, what you tolerate, and who gets access to the parts of your life that require genuine loyalty. Turning betrayal from a permanent wound into a lesson about human behavior, boundaries, and discernment, without allowing one person's dishonesty to convince you that everyone is dishonest. Because becoming suspicious of the entire world would mean allowing the betrayer to damage relationships they never even touched. And you don't owe them that much power. You can remain kind without being naive, generous without being careless, trusting without being blind, and compassionate without ignoring evidence. Because wisdom isn't learning to hate people after they disappoint you. It's learning how to see them more clearly without losing your own character in the process, while their behavior becomes information rather than a definition of your worth. Their betrayal becomes a boundary rather than a permanent identity, and their choices become a reminder to pay attention to consistency instead of promises, allowing you to move forward with stronger standards, clearer judgment, and far less interest in convincing people to treat you properly, because people who truly value your presence rarely require endless explanations about why basic respect matters. While those who repeatedly cross the line eventually reveal that the problem was never your inability to explain the boundary, it was their unwillingness to respect it, leaving you with the freedom to stop chasing understanding from people who benefited from keeping you confused, and start investing that energy into people whose actions make trust feel safe rather than complicated, while you continue learning to judge character not by appearances, speeches, or temporary performances, but by patterns, choices, consistency, and what remains when nobody is watching. Because eventually every performance becomes difficult to maintain, and when the mask slips, you don't need to become cruel. You simply need to see clearly enough to decide who still belongs in your life, and who no longer gets the privilege of being close to you. Pain has a way of teaching lessons that comfort never bothers to explain, and betrayal is one of those teachers nobody asks for, but almost everyone remembers. When someone disappoints you, the first reaction is usually emotional. You want answers. You want justice. You want to understand why they did it, what they said, who knew, and how long it had been happening. Your mind starts replaying conversations like a detective, with absolutely no intention of sleeping tonight. But eventually, you have to ask a more useful question. What can this experience teach me about people, about boundaries, and about myself? Because pain becomes dangerous when it only produces bitterness. If betrayal teaches you to trust nobody, then the person who hurt you has managed to damage every future relationship you might have had. That's a terrible victory to give them. Instead, let the experience make you more discerning, not more paranoid. There's a difference. Discernment means you pay attention. You don't automatically believe every promise. You watch whether words match actions. You notice how someone behaves when they don't get what they want. You observe whether they respect your boundaries when there is no reward for doing so. You notice whether they celebrate your success without secretly competing with you. You don't become suspicious of everyone. You simply stop ignoring patterns. Maybe before this experience you gave people access too quickly. Maybe you trusted words more than behavior. Maybe you kept making excuses for someone because accepting the truth would have been painful. That's information too. Not a reason to hate yourself. A reason to become wiser. The goal isn't to build a fortress around your heart so nobody can ever reach you again. That's not protection. That's loneliness wearing expensive armor. The goal is to build better doors. Let people earn access. Let consistency create trust. Let time reveal character. You don't need to know someone's entire life story before deciding whether they deserve a small amount of trust. You can simply watch what they do with the trust you give them. And when someone breaks it, you don't have to immediately destroy the relationship or immediately forgive them. You can pause and evaluate. Was it a mistake? Was there accountability? Did their behavior change? Was there a pattern? Those questions are more useful than simply asking whether you're still angry. Because anger tells you that something mattered, but discernment tells you what to do next. Maybe the right answer is a conversation. Maybe it's distance. Maybe it's ending the relationship. Maybe it's simply sharing less personal information. Whatever the decision, let it come from clarity rather than revenge. Revenge keeps you emotionally connected to the person who hurt you. Discernment allows you to learn and move forward, and that's the transformation you want. You don't want to become someone who spends years saying, "I'll never trust anyone again." You want to become someone who says, "I'll trust differently now." That's a much stronger statement. It means you haven't allowed one painful experience to destroy your ability to connect with good people. It means you've upgraded your standards without abandoning your humanity. While the people who expected betrayal to make you bitter watch, you become more selective instead, more observant, more patient, and far less willing to ignore the signs you once explained away, because you finally understand that wisdom isn't knowing who will hurt you before they do. It's becoming capable of recognizing unhealthy patterns earlier, and having enough self-respect to respond when you see them, turning disappointment into better judgment, rejection into stronger boundaries, and betrayal into a lesson about what genuine loyalty actually looks like, without allowing the experience to convince you that kindness is weakness, or that trust is stupidity, because the world still contains people who deserve your generosity, your friendship, your honesty, and your confidence, but they don't need to receive all of those things immediately. They can earn them through consistency, accountability, respect, and the simple evidence of what they repeatedly choose when nobody is forcing them to behave well. While you continue moving forward with your eyes open rather than your heart closed, understanding that being careful doesn't mean being cold, and having boundaries doesn't mean becoming cruel. It simply means you have learned that access to your life is a privilege and not an automatic entitlement. And once you understand that, pain becomes less like a prison and more like information, something you can examine, learn from, and eventually leave behind without carrying every wound into every new relationship, while the person who hurt you becomes only one chapter in a much larger story, not the author of every chapter that follows, because the real victory isn't making them regret what they did. It's becoming wise enough that what they did no longer determines how you treat yourself, how you choose people, or how you build your future, allowing the lesson to remain while the resentment gradually loses its purpose, and allowing your standards to become stronger without allowing your heart to become smaller. Because you don't need to become suspicious of the entire world just because one person gave you a reason to question them. You simply need to become better at recognizing who consistently brings honesty, respect, and peace into your life and who repeatedly brings confusion, manipulation, and disappointment. And once you learn that difference, you can protect yourself without becoming someone you don't recognize, carrying the lesson forward while leaving the unnecessary bitterness behind, and letting the experience sharpen your judgment without allowing it to steal your ability to trust wisely, connect genuinely, and keep moving toward people and places where your boundaries are respected rather than tested. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can make it dark, cynical, psychologically intense. And sharply provocative revenge feels attractive when you're hurt because it promises something simple: They hurt you, so you hurt them back, and somehow the universe is balanced again. Beautiful little fantasy. Except revenge rarely gives you what it promised. You get a moment of satisfaction, maybe a few people cheering you on, maybe the person finally realizes you aren't going to tolerate what happened. And then what? You're still thinking about them, still checking what they're doing, still measuring whether they regret it, still allowing their actions to occupy space inside your mind. That's not freedom. That's another form of attachment. Clarity is different. Clarity doesn't need a dramatic confrontation or a perfectly timed comeback. It asks you to look at what happened without allowing anger to distort the lesson. Maybe someone betrayed you. Maybe they lied. Maybe they talked about you behind your back. Maybe they manipulated a situation and expected you to remain unaware. Once you know the truth, you have information. The question becomes what you do with it. You can spend your energy exposing every secret, collecting evidence, recruiting people to your side, and trying to make everyone see how terrible they were. Or you can quietly decide that the relationship no longer deserves the same level of access to your life. That's often more powerful than revenge, because it changes your behavior instead of trying to control theirs. You can't force someone to feel guilty. You can't force someone to apologize sincerely. You can't force someone to understand the damage they caused. You can only decide what you will tolerate going forward. That's where clarity becomes strength. You stop asking, how do I make them regret losing me? And start asking, what does this information require me to change? Maybe you need stronger boundaries. Maybe you need to stop oversharing. Maybe you need to choose your friends more carefully. Maybe you need to stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. Maybe you need to leave a situation that repeatedly destroys your peace. These choices don't look dramatic from the outside, but they can completely change your life. And don't confuse clarity with pretending you aren't angry. You can be furious and still be intelligent. You can be hurt and still be disciplined. You can want justice and still refuse to destroy yourself trying to achieve it. Emotions are real, but they don't automatically deserve the steering wheel. Give yourself time before making irreversible decisions. Verify what you can. Consider whether the information is reliable. Protect yourself if there is genuine danger or serious harm. And if the situation is beyond what you can handle safely, involve someone trustworthy or appropriate professional support rather than trying to carry everything alone. The point isn't to become emotionless. It's to become deliberate, while the people who expected your pain to turn into chaos watch you become quieter, more selective, and less interested in proving anything, because you finally understand that your peace is not something you have to sacrifice just to demonstrate that you were wronged. And your future doesn't need to become a courtroom where everyone from your past is permanently on trial. You can acknowledge what happened, learn from it, set consequences where necessary, and keep walking, leaving their explanations, excuses, guilt, and opinions where they belong, outside the part of your life you're building now. Because sometimes the strongest response to betrayal isn't revenge at all. It's becoming so clear about what you value that the person who hurt you no longer has the ability to decide what kind of person you become afterward, allowing the experience to make you wiser without making you cruel, more observant without making you paranoid, and more protective of yourself without turning your heart into a locked room. While you stop chasing closure from people who may never give it and start creating closure through your own decisions, recognizing that you don't need their apology to establish a boundary, their confession to validate your experience, or their regret to justify your decision to move forward, because closure can sometimes be nothing more complicated than accepting the information you have, accepting what you cannot change, and deciding what you will do differently from this point forward, turning a painful discovery into a clearer standard for the future, choosing relationships where honesty is normal rather than something you have to beg for, choosing people whose actions make trust easier rather than harder, and choosing your own peace even when revenge would be easier to explain to everyone around you. Because revenge keeps the story alive, while clarity lets the story become a lesson. And once the lesson has been learned, you don't have to keep rereading the same painful chapter just to prove that it hurt. You can close the book on that part without pretending it never happened. Carry the wisdom forward and leave the bitterness behind, while the people who expected you to remain trapped in anger slowly become irrelevant to the direction your life takes. Because the real victory isn't watching someone suffer after they hurt you. It's reaching a point where their choices no longer control your emotions, your decisions, your relationships, or your future, leaving you free to build something better with the clarity they never expected you to gain from the betrayal they thought would destroy your peace.